Sometimes art is big. Sometimes it's grandiose. It can reach soaring heights with climactic finales. But sometimes doesn't mean always. There are many outstanding examples of subtlety in Frieren Beyond Journey's End. Some probably stuck with you, but true to a video about subtlety, I'm going to choose one that I think doesn't come to mind first. One from an episode I've already talked about. My name is Pei, and today we're going to be talking about these little guys. While at first glance these just seem to be squirrels, don't be tricked. This is a fantasy story, and nothing's more fantasy than taking animals from our world and giving them different names. These guys are seed rats, and what makes them special isn't just that they're important to the story, but more specifically that they are, yet somehow they blend in with all the other countless pieces of information that are exposed to us in Frieren that are never extrapolated on. We're going to be talking about a lot of things today, so I'm breaking them up into three major parts. The first is storytelling structure. Chekhov's gun argues that anything introduced to a story should be pertinent to the story itself. But in the process of only ever highlighting information that is pertinent to the story, you create an incredibly predictable system. And something that can consistently add a realistic feeling to any story when done properly is the introduction of information that doesn't directly serve the plot, but still feels true to the world around it. And then on top of that, sprinkling in important information for the plot amongst that large barrage of real world building. I think a great example where an artist has been incredibly successful with this type of subtle storytelling is Hayao Miyazaki. Think about how many times people have talked about the train scene from Spirited Away, and how that scene in particular doesn't do much to serve the plot, and in many other films would have been reduced to a short montage. However, that's not to say that anyone making stories would benefit from this style of creation. I'm not saying it's a good idea to just throw significantly more information at the audience. If done poorly, it's really confusing, and I've seen a lot of people criticize Miyazaki's most recent film, The Boy and the Heron, for this exact reason. There's a fine line between nuance and nonsense, so the main danger of this type of storytelling is information overload. Writers, producers, and studios often vocalize how important every second in a story is. But when you get lost in storytelling that's too efficient, you lose what world building is, which is to create a setting for the characters to exist in that doesn't feel like it disappears as soon as it goes off frame. Like I said last week, good writing implies stuff that's going on beyond what we can see. And I think that's a major component of what makes these scenes so significant, the ones that almost feel throwaway or are never given explanation. In reality, there's not meaning to every single thing we're introduced to, and that can help a lot when it comes to making a world feel full, because my favorite settings, especially in fantasy, aren't just there to serve the plot or characters. They feel like a living, breathing world, and this is where Miyazaki and the creators of Frieren really thrive, in subtle, beautiful world building. So why doesn't everyone tell stories this way? When you introduce a lot of information and show scenes that may not be directly important for the plot, you risk alienating your audience by confusing them. It's very easy to get lost while consuming a story. So a very important part of telling stories, with some exception, is guiding your audience so they know what's going on. That exception, by the way, is sometimes writers do purposely confuse their audiences, but that's a fine line to walk, and it's very easy, if you mess it up, to end up with everyone disengaged. So how does this apply to the second episode of Frieren Beyond Journey's End? Common sentiment I've seen in the comment section of my most recent video is that Frieren is an incredibly dense show. Many people who thought they were 8 or 9 episodes in came back to realize they'd only watched a couple. It's something that's consistent across the entire series with one exception, which I think was on purpose, but we'll get to that later. These episodes are so full of information and story that I'm shocked at how much they're able to tell in such a short amount of time. And that's also juxtaposed with the fact that I think this show takes tons of time to tell the story it wants to. I think it's well paced, but I wouldn't be shocked if someone walked away from watching it saying, it's too slow for me. Because my experience watching Frieren was full of contradiction, a constantly adapting oxymoron. How can a show feel so densely packed, but also very airy and full of space? How can it explore so many different ideas, but also feel like it's constantly meandering? Well, I think a major contributing factor to this is the way the story is told subtly. The world feels so big because they include so much information that isn't directly tied to the story. Because Frieren isn't exactly a show about a specific story. More so the adventure and experiences, it's almost episodic, except for the fact that they're densely filled with character development and overarching themes. Because as a baseline to enjoy the episode, you don't have to fully understand the depth behind it. But like most pieces of media that lend themselves to analysis, there's huge amounts of substance behind the initial first viewing. A beautiful example of this is Fern's relationship with nature around her. There's this running theme throughout the series that constantly, when given an opportunity, Fern's gonna have a little moment with some sort of animal or creature. When she's learning magic, she has birds landing on her. She interacts with the giant tortoise in episode 2, and in episode 3, she pets a cat. That one's a little bit more relatable. But theoretically, there's lots you could infer about what this is supposed to represent in the story, though in season 1, they never explicitly give an answer. Maybe it represents Fern's natural affinity towards magic. In Frieren, there's a lot of metaphors that overlap magic and nature. Maybe it represents her kindness, the value in which she gives each living creature. It could represent her moving on past the hardships of her childhood, learning magic out in the forest with Hyder's guidance when she was his ward. It could represent many things, but we're not sure what it exactly represents because it's open to interpretation. So in episode 2, when Fern and Frieren are doing the rather mundane task of cleaning a statue, one that happens to be a statue of Himmel the hero, Fern finds 2 seed rats having snuck into the florist's store. Afraid that there might be some sort of repercussion for them stealing some of the seeds, she sneaks them out. Now this is where things get interesting. If this story closely followed the rules of Chekhov's gun, then those seed rats would definitely be important in some way. And they are, except for the fact that this story so far has introduced tons of little moments like Fern interacting with animals leading up to this. And that's only one example of many different parts of world building that this story participates in that aren't directly connected to the progression of plot. This isn't even the first introduction to seed rats that we've gotten in this episode. The opening scene of this second story that we get in episode 2 is of pumpkins being harvested, in which we're introduced to the seed rats. But the plot of this second story in episode 2 is ultimately about flowers and what they represent. Those blue moon weeds that we were talking about. Which, by the way, what a fantastic choice in name. A perfect balance between romantic and realistic. What a good example of small things that continuously add up to make for outstanding world building. Essentially, this flower was one of Himmel's favorite, and Frieren has a spell that will allow her the opportunity to create a field of flowers. Which, by the way, will be very important later in the story, but we'll get there eventually. So where's the conflict? Well, turns out Frieren, to use this spell, has to have seen the flower she wants to create. However, she's never seen a blue moon weed, and no one spotted one in the area for a couple decades. Then once again, in a blink of an eye, or rather a beautiful montage, Frieren and Fern have spent the last 6 months looking for this flower, and Fern has reached a breaking point. Unsure of how to voice her frustrations, Fern approaches the florist, asking for advice. And she urges Fern to communicate it directly to Frieren. Despite her appearance and many of her actions, she's more mature than she lets on. So they sit down and have a conversation, which the presentation and way it plays out is just a remarkably cool scene. Fern expresses how she feels, and Frieren acknowledges those emotions. This conflict is small in the grand scheme of things, but it's another example of subtle storytelling. It doesn't really do much initially to further the plot of this story. However, it feels like an incredibly realistic form of conflict. A major component of this series is the way Frieren perceives time. Trying to offer an olive branch, or in this case, a solution, Fern presents Frieren a bag of rare seeds related to the blue moon weed. A gift from the florist. And while Frieren acknowledges her feelings, she can only guarantee that they'll move on soon. Fern, much like anyone who's young and spent too long in a place they didn't want to, is concerned. Before suddenly, seed rats steal those same seeds. And Frieren shares that seed rats famously bury their food to hide it. They also famously forget where they buried their food very often, using a magical spell to follow their footprints. Another example of something they never overtly explain, just show the audience. They track the seed rat back to an abandoned tower. And we're given a flashback to Frieren's previous adventure, where she took a desolate set of ruins and created a field of flowers, where Himmel shared 2 things with her. First, placing a wreath of flowers on her head, and second, sharing that he loves blue moon weeds, a flower native to his home. Jumping back to the present, we see Frieren pick up a blue petal at the base of the tower. and then levitating to the top, Frieren close behind, Frieren sees a beautiful collection of blue moonweeds. I think this is the first time in the series we get a big moment, one that feels like a magnificent and huge triumph. Which is funny because it kind of feels like what I was talking about before, it's almost an oxymoron. While there aren't really any stakes, there's still a substantial significance. This scene hits so hard because it's set up by the most beautiful, subtle world building. One where seed rats and flowers are intermingled with giant tortoises and cauldrons. Frieren doesn't just embrace subtle storytelling, it flourishes in it. Oh yeah, and we're only on episode 2. Thank you for watching. This video is the third in a running series about Frieren. If you enjoyed it, come back next week for another, or go check out my previous 2. If you want to support me or this series, consider going to my Patreon where I have 4 exclusive video essays up now. Thanks, see you next week.